Good morning. Welcome to the rainy first Sunday of Epiphany, Sunday formation at Calvary. I'm Heidi Rupke, and we are gathered here in the building at Calvary and also online to learn from a friend this morning, Beverly Tsakonayas, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Memphis. And Beverly actually was scheduled to come and speak with us in the fall, but had to reschedule because of some conflicts there. But she was originally engaged by our temporary adult formation team because we were looking at the theme of relationships and how do our relationships work out not only in the personal sphere, but in more of a global sense. And Beverly's research is in the modern Middle East, and particularly in trauma and healing there. She teaches courses in world history and Middle Eastern history, and she's been at the University of Memphis since 2013. Her PhD's from Washington University in St. Louis, and her first book was published just this last summer, and it's called Disturbing Spirits, Mental Illness, Trauma, and Treatment in Modern Syria and Lebanon. She and her husband, Matt, have 6-year-old twin sons, and they live in Midtown. Yes, she has a fellow mother of twin boys in the audience here, and they enjoy walking the Old Forest Loop in Overton Park. So if you see them there, be sure to say hello. Beverly, we are honored to learn along with you this morning, and we look forward to your presentation.
First, thank you to Heidi and Robin for inviting me and working out the logistics. I'm so thankful that we were able to reschedule my talk that was originally planned in October, back when I was getting over a bad cold, thankfully not COVID. Also, welcome to everybody watching online, and I wish all of you here and on the internet a happy and healthy new year, and I hope we as a community will continue to do whatever possible to work together locally and nationally, even internationally, to get through this pandemic. Heidi mentioned to me that a few months ago, Calvary Episcopal had been working through a series on relationships in a world context. And I want to keep that going with our material today, so I'll focus on a few so-called hotspots in the Middle East with some basic background on geography, politics, current events, and then I'll switch gears a bit to talk about ways people and groups are trying to heal, including with a few examples I explored in my book. So you have all probably heard about the ongoing Syrian civil war, the tragedy unfolding in Yemen, the aftermath of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the long road to rebuild in Iraq, and of course the conflict in Israel and Palestine was in the news again during the summer of 2021. But what I'm here to touch on today is how conflicts have political, cultural, religious, and historical dimensions, and how they are connected to each other. This morning I'm going to give a roughly 35-minute presentation highlighting the history and current conflicts plaguing the region, but I end with mentioning various modes of healing, political, religious, medical, that have been developing in these regions to build safer communities, to cope with a challenging political and economic landscape. Because when we are faced with calamity and catastrophe, as so many in the Middle East are, the best you can work toward is beyond surviving. We don't want to just survive, we want to thrive and leave our children and grandchildren a safer, more beautiful, more peaceful and loving world than we or our grandparents grew up in. It's the best any of us can do, and our futures, our legacies hang in the balance. However, we are not going to solve any of these conflicts today. It does not fall on anyone's shoulders here to carry the burden of tikkun olam, what people in my faith community say in Hebrew to mean to repair the world, to pursue peace and justice. But I also don't want people to leave this talk today super bummed about the mess that the Middle East is in. So I will try to keep it as light as we can, all things considered. So I love using this map on the first day of my Modern Middle East class. It's from a 2014 article in The Atlantic by Nick Danforth titled 15 maps that don't explain the Middle East at all. But what we have here are 3 zones, so to speak. In the dark green, we have the traditional heart of the Middle East, states along the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian or Arabian Gulf, like Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, areas with large percentages of Arabic speakers. But we also have non-Arab countries like Iran, where there are a lot of Persian speakers. So that right there shows 2 different ethno-linguistic communities, Arabic, Persian, but there are also Kurds, Jews, mostly only in Israel at this point, and a substantial percentage of those Jews are not Arab, but for example, Ashkenazi Jews with heritage in Europe, Eastern Europe. There are Coptic Christians in Egypt, Maronite Catholics in Lebanon, who sometimes don't see themselves as ethnically Arab. In the sort of olive or middle green is the greater Middle East, from Morocco in the west to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east, and as far south as Somalia, where there are lots of Muslims, but we are talking about populations that are not ethnically Arab. Then in the lightest green in Central Asia, and that's Central Asia and the Caucasus, including Kazakhstan, that some of you may have heard in the news, with their very tragic, and I think it's going to get a lot worse, political situation. And those are Eurasian countries that are socio-politically connected to the Middle East. And as a reminder, most Muslims in the world are not Arab. There are hundreds of millions of Muslims in India and Indonesia, for example. Sorry, I was having trouble with the clicker. I hope I don't mess it up. Yes. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. So this slide is a quote from the recently departed Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Violence begets separation, and separation begets more violence. Fear only generates more fear. Combatants for peace seeks a way out of this whirlpool, of death. God bless you, you healers of the Holy Land. So I put this quote here because we're talking about political conflict and political healing today. But that political healing has to come with some awareness of trauma. Combatants for Peace is an organization in Israel that brings Jews, Muslims, and Christians together in the Holy Land. But it's an especially powerful group because of what these Jews, Christians, and Muslims were doing before they fought for peace. They were not just civilians. They were Israeli soldiers in Palestinian refugee camps. They were Palestinian militants. But they turned away from this. And not only turned away from violence, they worked with each other to build relationships, friendships with their enemy. They work on a human-to-human level and build up to schools and neighborhoods, like how Fighters for Peace does in Lebanon. Oh, yeah. This is my why should we care slide. Some aspects of this may seem obvious. We want peace in the Middle East. I mean, who doesn't, right? But the research questions I ask as a medical and cultural historian are about belonging. Who belongs? Who decides? All of that is embedded in political, religious, economic, and cultural contexts. How does a government decide to rule over its people? Are people of different colors, different religious backgrounds treated the same in the law? Do leaders in the British and French empires decide it's their job to civilize other parts of the world, to make a colony or a mandate after World War I with the League of Nations, as they did in Syria and Britain did in Palestine? Who gets to stay when the anti-colonial movements lead to calls for a new nation? Who is expelled or made to feel unwelcome? How is disease managed? There are ways that groups of people can be seen as infecting the country for any number of reasons. Some more connected to racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, or homophobia than to evidence-based scientific research, for example. Coping with trauma and illness can lead to escapism and substance use. The Lebanese mental health care system is woefully inadequate, and it's one of the best in the region. Drug use during and since the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990 has increased, and the international drug trade helped fuel the Civil War, including drugs leaving Lebanon, entering the United States. People are hurting, and for many it feels like the system, the political system, the medical system, economic system, relationships with neighbors, friends, and family, for many they feel like all of that has failed them. Where we are and who we are makes a difference in how we live. what we leave behind, and how we are remembered or forgotten. This intersectionality wheel is for low and middle income countries, but in some ways it's relevant to high income countries too. You can see the middle circle there in white is for one person, their unique circumstances of power, privilege, and identity. To take, for example, an Arabic-speaking Muslim day laborer living in Gaza, someone who knows very little Hebrew, someone without an Israeli passport, with, let's say he's lucky enough to have a car, but the license plate color will show immediately that he does not have Israeli papers. So let's say he's 25 years old, muscular, brown-skinned, maybe with a trim beard, unmarried, no children, maybe in ill-fitting jeans or scuffed shoes since he can't afford the latest styles. Put this person in line at a checkpoint. He will be treated a certain way by the Israeli police, who may automatically classify him with his brown skin, his beard, his lack of Hebrew as a threat. Maybe he is sick and knows of a medical facility in Israel that has the life-saving care he needs, while the hospitals in Gaza are underfunded and had to turn him away. Those outer layers in the circle, the very outermost ones, that represents kind of larger forces and structures that can work to reinforce exclusion, like war, politics, the legal system. And then in the blue circle is forms of discrimination like ableism, racism, ageism, classism, sexism. And then in this green, you have things like gender, skin color, religion, refugee status. All of this marks us, how we are treated. I use this intersectionality wheel in my classes to show students how we are all embedded in systems. And this is as true today as it was in the past. And this is why I have students think about this before we even start looking at primary sources. So they can see in what context those sources were created. Who wrote that speech? Who was the intended audience? Who is in that photograph? Why was that law drafted? When and why did it pass? What was happening in people's lives? Were they Muslims in the United States right after 9/11 or right after the Patriot Act? Were they Japanese Americans in California during World War II when the US had internment camps? Were they indigenous when the death marches known as the Trail of Tears happened? Were they Chinese during the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States? Were they Jewish in Nazi Germany? Were they black or mixed race in South Africa during apartheid? Were they Muslim Palestinian refugees in the camps in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War, when the Maronite Catholic-dominated militia tore through and massacred so many in 1982? Were they suspected to be members of the Muslim Brothers in the Syrian city of Hama in 1983, when Hafez al-Assad's government massacred thousands of his opponents under cover of rooting out terrorism? And this is to give you a sense of the politics here. I'm sure many of you know of 1948 as the year the Jewish state of Israel was founded, a bright light for many Jews around the world after the darkness of the Holocaust in Europe. But that year is also known in Palestinian communities as the catastrophe, or Nakba, and 1967 as a major setback, a Naksa, when Gaza and the West Bank were acquired territories in war, and East Jerusalem fell to Israeli control, what Zionists call the reunification of Jerusalem, since only West Jerusalem had been captured in the 48 war. The First Intifada, which is Arabic for the shaking, was in the 1980s as Palestinians sought to overthrow systems they saw as oppressive. It was a diverse coalition of Christian and Muslim Palestinians, young and old, from hardliners to moderates, hoping to work through the political system, form political parties, get a voice in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. The Second Intifada in the early 2000s was much more desperate, much more violent. That's where suicide bombings in civilian areas became a common tactic. In the decades since the Second Intifada, the Jewish Israeli mainstream has moved much further to the right. The people who had been pro-peace in the 1990s calling for more force against Palestinians now. The Syrian military entered and occupied Lebanon from 1976 to 2005. And Israel waged war on Lebanon in 1982 and then occupied southern Lebanon until 2000. Mind you, the Lebanese Civil War was happening almost that whole time, from 1975 to 1990. And after the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, where Jewish Americans and Israelis watched Israeli police pretty much drag ultra-Orthodox settlers out of their homes in Gaza, settlers set their sights on the West Bank. which had been growing since the 1960s, but really exploded in the mid-2000s and continues today. With the corruption of many high-level, high-profile Palestinian and Israeli leaders, the subsequent frustration, both in Israel and in Palestine, have led to mass protests against politicians like Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, even at the height of COVID restrictions pre-vaccine. But these protests were more about the rising cost of living in Israel for Jewish Israelis than they were about dismantling the settlements, where you can build huge houses for much less money and drive on highways that bypass Palestinian areas altogether to maintain separation. Gershon Shafir, the author of that book there, is an Israeli sociologist and historian, and his book pictured here was published in 2017, 50 years after 1967. And that's what he's referring to in the book's title, A Half Century of Occupation. But to many Palestinians and to many people throughout the Middle East, Israel is seen as something of a colonizer in the region, going back to 1948. There was, in the political Zionist movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, a group that was called the Jewish Colonization Association, with the goal of purchasing land and building homes for Jewish Zionists. So there was language around this concept of colonies and colonizing well before World War I. But the moment of what Palestinians call the catastrophe, or the Nakba, is from 1947 and 48, which we can go into more detail about that war in the Q&A if you want. But just to clarify some terms, next one, sorry. Not all Israelis are Jewish. In fact, in the past decade, records suggest 1 in 5 are Muslim or Christian. And the numbers go to 1-to-1 ratio if you include the West Bank and Gaza. There were also Palestinian families in the 1948 borders that never left. And they have Israeli citizenship, like a lot of Arabs in Haifa, for example. There are families that became refugees from Jerusalem who now live in refugee camps in the West Bank without the legal protections of Jordanian citizenship that many in the West Bank who were not refugees had from 48 to 67. So there's a lot of layers here. Like, you can be a Palestinian refugee in the West Bank and be treated differently than a Palestinian who has always lived in the West Bank in terms of the legal system. Yair Aron is an Israeli historian who has done some research in Jewish and non-Jewish Israeli communities to try to understand some of these complexities. He's the author of that book there, Israeli Identities, Jews and Arabs Facing the Self and the Other. But by the way, calling non-Jewish Israelis Arab, like calling all of them Arab, lumps together a lot of different people, including non-Arabs. For example, there are ethnic Armenian Christians that have been living in Jerusalem since the time of the Armenian genocide in 1916, and there have been Armenians in the old city of Jerusalem since before that, and they identify as Palestinians, but they're not Arab, they're Armenian. But the Israeli government calls almost every non-Jewish Israeli and every Palestinian Arab, and they do not call Arab Jews Arab. They're labeled Mizrahi, or Eastern. So there's a linguistic separation, as well as political, that has roots in discrimination. The authors of the book on the left, on the right here, Bashir Bashir and Amos Goldberg, published a controversial but thought-provoking study on the use of terms and narratives that I highly recommend you all read. The University of Memphis has an ebook copy, by the way, if anybody has UMIDs. It's about the Holocaust and the Nakba, and how we need to create a new grammar, a new syntax even, around trauma that sees these two events as linked, rather than as completely separate. It's important because of the role these traumatic events play in the collective and national memory of the groups involved, where people on one side or the other feel their own community's pain in some way denies the space to empathize with the other community, or acknowledge the power of that event in shaping trauma and legacies today. These two events are very significant to the national narrative around the identities for these communities. That's why it's so key to find space for each other's narratives. In other words, Palestinians who deny the Holocaust but discover it really did happen may worry that the Holocaust entitles Jewish Israelis to exist and stay, while Jewish Israelis worry that admitting that the Nakba happened might lead people to empathize with Palestinians to the point that they argue for return of land, or at least return of Palestinians to Israel. But admitting that the Holocaust and the Nakba happened does not automatically dictate a future political trajectory. It is simply an acknowledgement of what happened. Starting there is better than denying the traumas, since that will only lead to more violence. This is an example of that violence. This heat map about settler violence in the West Bank, with Jerusalem there in red, just like that. So a lot of the violence is centered right around the Holy City. This heat map is from B'Tselem, which that's the Hebrew that refers to all people created in God's image. All people, no matter your religion. And B'Tselem is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. And the data in blue on the right about struggles like food insecurity is from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and UNISPAL, the United Nations Information System on the Question of Palestine. This data is from a 2021 monthly report about 2.5 million Palestinians in some level of need, including food insecurity, housing. So, and I have a lot of links embedded in this that I'm happy to have people have copies of if they want to click. So what happens when a national narrative is at odds with collective memory of groups within that nation? This is not unique to Israel or to Lebanon. It's not unique to the Middle East. Our own country has narratives around the origin of the nation, the founding of the country, the way we've dealt with specific wars, like our Civil War, obviously, but also wars on concepts or substances, like the war on terror or the war on drugs. I want you to take what you know about the pain and anger in this country, about the conflicting narratives around something as straightforward as opioid use, and the different directions that could go, whether a government administration sees this as a health crisis versus a criminal issue, and compare the approaches regarding different kinds of illegal substances and different racial groups in the 1980s versus now, and then apply it to a place as complicated as the Middle East. It's no wonder people are angry. But we are talking about areas where the government is so corrupt that people have little faith in their political leaders to make much of a meaningful difference for ordinary people. And I don't just mean Egypt, Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, though obviously those are hugely devastating situations. I mean even Israel for Jewish Israelis. There are also Muslim and Christian Israelis, Arabs and Armenians who identify as Palestinian Israelis. I mean in the 1948 borders of Israel, not Gaza or the West Bank. And in Lebanon, we are talking about 17 different religious sects and sectarianism, this kind of scary sounding word about the politicization of religious sect. In Lebanon, there is a pact from the 1930s that pretty much requires only a Maronite Catholic can be president. Only a Sunni Muslim can be prime minister. Only a Shi'i person can be speaker of their parliament. In the Lebanese civil war, the Maronites and the Israeli government worked together in supporting the South Lebanese army militia that was in Najnub, that bottom area south of Beirut. And they had prisons there and torture. And then there was a militia called Hope, or Amal, that was Shi'i. And then there were Palestinian refugees in Lebanon caught in the middle, who ended up taking sides that further politicized religion. So how do we remember the Lebanese civil war? How does that impact us in the present? How might it shape trajectories for our future and their future? Consider the example of the American University in Beirut's Library Research Guides on the Lebanese Civil War. They have a fantastic website, by the way. You guys should check it out. They have among their sources this memory map at the top there, the Act for the Disappeared. It honors the memories of those who disappeared, names them, puts faces on the sites where they were erased, and you can click through it. It's got like ArcGIS data on it. It's really powerful. And this is especially difficult because Lebanon had something like a blanket amnesty for people that committed war crimes in the Civil War. And so this is kind of the way for regular civilian Lebanese to make some space for their own pain, where the government is denying them the chance to air their grievances and bring the perpetrators to justice. And that's part of the reason Lebanon is still roiling, and they had a revolution in 2005 that led to the withdrawal of the Syrian military finally. So I've just mentioned some material about politics to situate you, but I want you to keep an eye on how these past wars continue to leave their mark on communities in Israel, Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and Syria today. The Massacres of Hama in 1983, and it's kind of like, that's Hama there. And look at how close, like, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, everything, so it's very close. Very easy for missiles to reach each other. So the Massacres of Hama in 1983 had their 30-year commemoration in 2013, just as the Syrian civil war was turning into an ISIS bloodbath. And ordinary Syrians are painfully aware that the Assad dynasty is trying to hold on until the bitter end. Even with anti-Syrian government and anti-ISIS Kurdish forces, including the Yazidi all-women militia receiving US tactical support, ISIS was eventually largely pushed back, but the Syrian dictatorship is as strong as ever. Lebanese politics continues to be influenced by the Syrian government, and Palestinian refugees in Syria and Lebanon are stuck in the middle with virtually no say in what happens in Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza, or the villages they left behind in 48 or 67. The woman in this screenshot in the middle is a famous Yazidi singer turned soldier who led an all-female militia against ISIS in Iraq in 2016. The BBC Three did a documentary on it. The book about Palestinian women is from 1998, and the one on gender politics in Saudi Arabia is from 2013. Women and men in the Middle East are pushing back on systems of oppression. Some have internalized it. Some are from communities that don't want equal treatment, women and men, but others are working to change their systems from within. The documentary Feminists Inshallah from 2014, directed by Feriel Ben Mahmoud, is one I recommend to students. It's also available free on YouTube, with interviews and data on female political activists, including Muslim Arab women, going all the way back to World War I. We, the former fighters, have decided to become fighters for peace. This is from the Lebanese group Fighters for Peace, similar to the group Combatants for Peace in Israel that I mentioned earlier. But we can also think about political violence as a form of healing. And I'm not advocating for this. I'm talking about the theory around it. So Frantz Fanon, the Martiniquean psychiatrist who wrote Wretched of the Earth about the Algerian War for Independence in the 1950s and 60s, he wrote about cathartic violence. If, as Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in his introduction to Fanon's work, the condition of the native is a nervous condition, if, in other words, the political system is making you ill, then the way to improve your health is to change the political system. And we can see this in the Yazidi fighter on the slide before this. It was vengeance for the Yazidi genocide by ISIS in 2014 of the women and girls of her community that ISIS trapped, and some of them are still missing. To fight ISIS and to have them die by the hands of a woman, in the eyes of many of the ISIS members, is the ultimate punishment because it denies them paradise in the afterlife to die by the hands of a woman. So for that Yazidi singer, she turned away from her music career to fight. And so the communist Greek Orthodox Christian Lebanese woman, I know that sounds like a lot, but trust me, she exists, Soha Bishara, she was born in 1967, and even though she was Christian, the civil war in Lebanon was not Christians against Muslims. She was Greek Orthodox, and the Maronite Catholics had the political power in Lebanon. So she was part of a disadvantaged community, even though she was Christian. And she turned to communism, where Christians and Muslims in Lebanon felt that they could find a way out of the sectarian problems. But she saw her attempted assassination of Antoine Lahad, who was a general in the South Lebanese army and who worked with the Maronite Catholics and the Israeli government to torture Shia, not her community, in southern Lebanon. Soha saw her violence as a way to heal Lebanon and end the civil war. She ultimately spent 10 years in Khiam prison and was released after a lot of international outcries, and then wrote a memoir, which is a very important book. And so if you feel overwhelmed with all of this, I don't know if this is going to make you feel better or not, but I find it overwhelming too, and I've been working in this field for a few years. And I happen to be a deeply empathic person, and I can tell you honestly that I have struggled for years with how to cope with the data I work with how to present it to students, and to people outside of my field in venues like this. The last thing I want to do is to cause people harm. And some of the material I work with can be triggering for survivors of war, for example. I've been to the Middle East a few times. In 1999, when I was in high school, I spent a summer in Israel. In 2003, when the US started another war in Iraq, I was in Israel for a year of study abroad. And the last time the US bombed Iraq, Iraq bombed Israel. So the Israelis were prepping for that from the 1990s bombing. And they handed out anti-nerve gas and gas masks to folks, including foreigners like me. And I was in the 2006 war in Lebanon, where the Israeli military bombed the Beirut airport. So I was evacuated with many others in my language program at Lebanese American University by Norwegian cargo ship to Cyprus after a week in the war. And the Lebanese did not hand out gas masks. They were a lot less organized than the Israelis. And you know, it was a country that had just been 25 years out from a civil war in Lebanon. And to say goodbye to my teachers, especially the elderly ones who had seen the civil war, it was really difficult. And I lived in Syria for about 9 months in 2009 and 2010. And most recently in 2019, I was in the West Bank. So I've spent some time living as a student or researcher in Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and I speak Arabic and Hebrew, and I've collected data from a lot of different communities in the region. I don't know how they do it, to be honest with you. But I've also met people from those areas who work in trauma studies, in academia, medicine, law, politics, and I can share with you a bit about what they've done, what hopeful directions they're headed in. So I'll just mention a few here. So this sweet person here is Roni Berger. He's a Jewish Israeli researcher and psychologist. He works in compassion and de-radicalization research. I met him in the summer of 2017. He presented some of his research to me and a group of other foreign academics invited by Tel Aviv University. And I asked him after his presentation if I could have a hug. And he laughed and complied, saying an oxytocin boost was good for us. And that kicked off a few more hugs, hug requests from other faculty in the workshop. So Roni, he has worked with former terrorists to turn them away from violence. He's on the faculty of the Stress, Crisis, and Trauma program at Tel Aviv University. He directs the Disaster Relief and Rehabilitation Unit at Brit Olam, an international relief organization. And Brit Olam is Hebrew for covenant or pact of the world. And he's a fellow in Psychology Beyond Borders, a humanitarian group working to alleviate the psychological suffering in the aftermath of traumatic events from natural disasters to suicide bombing and war. Roni also is on the advisory board of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford University in California, where he helps design compassion cultivation programs to enhance community resiliency and to promote pro-social behavior and tolerance rather than anti-social. Super great guy. Roni is Jewish-Israeli, but there are Palestinian-directed groups too, like Al-Haq, which means the right or the truth, which was founded by lawyers in the West Bank in 1979, and they see law and human rights work as a form of healing. Groups also call awareness to the social and medical situations in places struggling with political violence, like B'Tselem. The World Health Organization in 2018 interviewed a doctor pictured here with the red crescent from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society in Gaza. His name is Imad, and he was interviewed after an attack on his life, and he said, physically, I'm feeling better, but mentally I feel destroyed. So healing the healers is also key to moving forward. And there are artists like those from Dar, the Decolonizing Architecture Art Residency, those two architects in the picture in the middle, who are Palestinian, and people like Tariq Osman, the laughing guy from Egypt, who work to bridge divides between East and West to create empathy and develop better informed economic policies in the region. I guess we could probably, yeah, I have a clip of some of his podcasts. He also has this podcast called No, about kind of religious belief and theology and I guess theosophy also, like how we know things in faith. It's a really beautiful podcast with a lot of.
This is BBC Radio 4. Since the Middle East uprisings of 2011, the events that have followed, particularly in Egypt and Syria, have been much in the news. But these are just the latest turns in a long and rich history, which the Egyptian writer Tariq Osman has been exploring in his series, The Making of the Modern Arab World. Today, in the last part, Tariq follows the decade leading up to the Arab Spring in 2011.
We are now in Duqi, in central Cairo. We've been waiting now for about 25 minutes almost without any kind of move.
The traffic.
Tens and tens of cars in the tunnel here that leads us to the other bank of the Nile.
Just being stuck on the street in Cairo in your car, it's a miserable condition, to be honest. When it takes you like 3 or 4 hours to get from one place to another, it's really hard to go to your work, it's really hard to meet with friends. Just the mere state of our traffic reflects how miserable we are. We're just stuck anywhere we are. Basically, in our economic situation, in our traffic situation is suffocating us, and political situation, we're reaching some sort of a dead end. So yeah, it's all connected somehow. In my opinion, it's one of the main reasons for why people revolted in 2011.
So that's just a tiny piece of it. He's got a lot of material that's worth checking out. He works with one of the major banks in the region, so but this series is to kind of help build some bridges between people there and here who may not have a lot of awareness about the experiences going on there. There's fighters for peace in Lebanon that I mentioned, combatants for peace in Israel, but it can feel Sisyphean. You try to work on this kind of thing when it feels like violence keeps happening, narratives stay one-sided, people don't seem willing to even hear the other side, let alone accommodate it. This 2015 painting by the Syrian artist pictured here, Anas Homsi, is incorporated into my book's cover design. I'll give you a second to think about it. What do you see in this painting? Why do you think it's called Wall of Memories? Walls can protect people inside a home if the foundation is strong. They can keep threats out, but they can also divide people, like the Berlin Wall, or trap people in, where they may suffocate. We have different walls within ourselves, walled off parts of ourselves that hurt too much to think about. The death of your child in war, perhaps, where you survived, and the White Helmets, the volunteer group in Syria, dug their little body out of the rubble too late. This was very difficult material for me to work with as a parent, but there are so many colors here, so many emotions. There is blood red, and these black lines that appear to be borders of bodies, but the colors bleed between those lines. We have lots of colors in us. We have these peaceful purples and blues, these almost joyful yellows. We have lots, we are more than just our pain. We have to be to survive and create joy in those who survive and to honor the memories of those who did not. This is part of the acknowledgments in my book, the section where I talk about my husband Matt and me welcoming our children into our lives. And I put here that we experienced the incredible awe and joy of seeing these fragile-looking little bodies grow and thrive in a country where they have easy access to urgent care, clean food and water, safe shelter, antibiotics, routine checkups, vaccinations. I can only imagine how horribly the mind and spirit breaks in civil war for those who've lost their children. So I end my acknowledgement section with part of a prayer that my faith community has in our weekly service. May we see the day when war and bloodshed cease, when a great peace will embrace the whole world. And my table of contents here is to show a little bit about what I include in that book. It's a 120-year span, roughly, that I cover. I talk about healing practices that existed before biomedical perspectives became more widespread. Healing practices, by the way, that continue to persist, especially in terms of mental health. And I also have a section about the origins of medical institutions in Syria and Lebanon, a chapter about the civil war in Lebanon and Syria, the trauma of surviving medical systems that were occasionally abusive, if you think especially about asylums, psychiatric hospitals in the early 20th century. And those of you who work in education, you might know that these sorts of books are a bit pricey, but I did drop off a copy for your library, so you are welcome to peruse it. There's also an ebook at the University of Memphis that you can get into, although the pictures look better in there than the ebook. Next slide. So this, part of what my book is about is the different forms of conflict and healing that exist. So along the Silk Road, and in many centuries of great empires, from the Ottoman and Safavid in the Middle East to the Mughal in the Indian subcontinent, there was a great deal of cross-cultural exchange, including in medical practices. So this is a unifying conceptual model of traditional Arabic and Islamic medicine that was developed by some doctors, Sara Arawi and Michael Fetters, that shows how this medicine has roots in 4 regional traditional healing systems, including TCM, that's traditional Chinese medicine, Persian, Unani, which is Greek and Galenic, ancient Greek, and Ayurvedic, which is from India. And so these actually blended, and you can see how the arrows go all across all of them. We're talking about centuries, as early as the 7th century of the Common Era, where you get prophetic tradition medicine. So medicine that has to do with the Prophet Muhammad. For example, that honey and the Quran can soothe your soul. Honey is really useful for a couple reasons, but I'll come back to that. But so these were also shaped by centuries of evidence-based practice involving Islamic medicine, with such luminaries as Ibn Sina or Avicenna, whose medical research in the 11th century became the guide for Christian Europe for centuries, until the 16th and 17th century breakthroughs in anatomy and circulation of the blood. And even after that, Ibn Sina's medical research was taught in many leading European and North American medical schools until the advent of germ theory in the 19th century. And even today, there are physiologists and physicians trained in Western medical practice who still turn to some applicability from Avicennan medicine. It's really fascinating stuff. And next slide, you can actually have combo deals where you can mix and match. So there's medicinal herbs, dietary practices, mind-body therapy, spiritual healing, applied therapy. You can kind of get some that combine these. So for example, if you wrote a verse from the Bible or the Quran on a non-poisonous leaf, that's important, and the leaf is your paper and honey is your ink, you can make a tincture, a Quranic tincture, a biblical tincture that's effectively an herbal tea that's been imbued with the healing power of God's word. Or if you did a bit of dhikr, which is chanting of religious verses while in motion, like the all-female zar ritual that has drums and dancing, you have mind-body therapy that is also spiritual healing because of the dhikr, the chanting from spiritual verses, and the social support from being around this community of women that could help the afflicted woman cope with whatever has ailed her. So there are ways in which traditional medicine can be really complementary or alternative medicine with biomedical approaches. And I have on this slide a quote from the early 1920s from a sheikh. His name was Sa'ad ad-Din al-Jabawi. He was in Nablus, which is in West Bank now. And he was a respected religious healer in the West Bank city of Nablus. And so I'll just read part of it. He said, this is from an article that was translated into English in the 1920s. I heal all diseases, but yet not all diseases have the same origin. Some have ordinary causes, and he's referring to Galenic medicine of too cold and too hot. Others come from the evil eye, and a third can come from a jinn that takes possession of the body. So jinn, like a genie in English. And so think back to our intersectionality wheel, and you'll note that systems might treat different people differently. Like a country's legal system might provide citizens, but not non-citizens, with access to free health care. Or a health network may give higher quality care to free versus enslaved people, or to a white versus non-white patient, or a patient of one religious background, not another, or people with quote-unquote defects, like specific developmental or cognitive disabilities, may be packed off to an institution, while others are seen as quote-unquote worthy enough of living amongst us. Or where patients might pay out of pocket for care. All of these we could describe as systems of oppression that will impact different people, rich or poor, Jewish or Muslim, disabled or not, differently. And a folk healer, a vernacular or popular healer, could step in those spaces to provide for those who are not provided for. If someone is considered unwell because of drug use, for example, and the system in that country is to criminalize addiction, or to try to target the suppliers for legal issues, but not build adequate treatment facilities for users, that system will impact people very differently. This is a big issue in Lebanon. And we're talking about a generation traumatized by the civil war they were born in or that their parents were born into since the 1970s. The US-born attorney Alia Malek, whose parents and grandparents are from Syria, wrote in her journalistic nonfiction, The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria, that the Syrian civil war had led to, quote, violence that would consume it whole and eventually damage the collective mental health of its people. And how have people explained that violence? Some historical fiction from the Lebanese Civil War and the Syrian Civil War describes perpetrators of violence as demon-possessed, jinn-possessed. What is at stake in legitimizing supernatural versus natural causes? Where have political narratives and medical or religious narratives overlapped? I have on this slide images of a few amulets for medical or religious protection with magical numbers from Arabic as an incantation to protect. And then there's also a book here called Sanity and Sanctity about ultra-Orthodox Jews and mental illness, and a movie called Intelligent Lives about developmentally disabled individuals in the United States, just to show you the different directions this kind of research can take. about how we treat ourselves and our loved ones when we perceive illness or problems, how we cope with that. How do we perceive how we come to be who we are? What narratives do we have to explain our health and our bodies? Who does our community want us to be? What do we want from our society? And this is my penultimate slide, the one where I get a bit more specific about historiography, about how historians have written history, about how we as consumers of historical research come to understand the ways we talk about the past. And I think one of the most effective directions to go with this kind of research is to really diversify the source base. So instead of just looking at patient records written by the doctors, also look at the memoirs, the poems or prose by survivors of the hospitals. Look at music and film. Conduct interviews for oral history. Look at research in disability studies, not just at research in political or diplomatic history, or even psychiatric history, which often privileges the very specific medicalized narrative of disability rather than a more social model. And you can look at my book or others like it. And I put a quote at the bottom here from a film by the Palestinian-Israeli filmmaker Mamdouh Hafdileh, whose father is a faith healer and an interpreter of dreams. And it was his father's wish to him in the film, and it's really my wish for all of us here today and online, in person and virtual, God willing, you'll find relief for all your troubles and you'll be strong in whatever work you do. Thank you, everybody. I have a bunch of extra slides that go into more detail about my work, but we can open up to discussion about any of the material we've talked about. Oh yeah, please use the microphone so the folks online can hear you.
I've got one. Hey, thank you for that. I love, for lots of reasons, bringing trauma and health and how we approach disease culturally in different places into these conversations that we might just leave to the political realm, and it's all tangled up. And it occurs to me as you were talking that most of even the metaphors we use in medicine are from war. And we've heard from some physicians even here in our community how our medical system is really good at acute care. It's focused on disease and not on health. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, when you talk about reconstructing the narratives and how do we tell the story, are there examples or are there strategies where how could we shift it rather than metaphors from war, fighting, winning, etc., to what does it mean to actually facilitate health and nurture health, which seems maybe to come out of some of the traditional approaches too. Can you speak to that? Does that make sense? Is that a question?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I definitely, cancer is a really good example of it, where people are kind of a survivor of cancer. They battle the cancer wins if you die. There's definitely, that sort of language, I think, is in some ways, it's really alienating to the person that's coping with it, because it's making their body the landscape of the battle, and it doesn't really leave the space for that person to rest, I think, in a way that could be really, and I'm not a physician, and there are a lot of the medical history that's being written in the Middle East is often by physicians who had an interest in history. And so the way they write is a little bit different than people like me that have more of a, I guess you could say, like interdisciplinary approach, because trauma studies and disability studies, we don't just look at medical records or the quote-unquote traditional historical records like newspapers. We'll also look to interview the people. So, for example, the CSXM community, the C for consumer, S survivor, X for ex-patient, and M for MAD, that material that's been written by the survivors of hospitals, they visualize the hospital as the battleground and the doctor as the general on the other side. And so there's ways in which looking at CSXM narratives can bring a more disability studies approach to the more kind of traditional medical history that is very oriented to, our hospital is our army, our doctors are our soldiers, and we're battling this disease, rather than coping with reality that everyone gets sick sometimes. We're not weak because we got sick. Like, that's just what happened. And then there's ways that this idea of the strong and weak body ends up part of this kind of national myth-making. So like in Israel, for example, Israeli soldiers, people that are about to become Israeli soldiers, which by the way happens at 18, so when the brain is not fully formed, and it's the perfect time to inculcate something, but it's 18-year-old Jewish Israeli men, and also Druze, who are not Jewish, but they get kind of lumped in. There's a whole side. I teach a whole class just on the Arab-Israeli conflict, where I go into a lot more detail about this, but there are some Arabs in Israel who do fight in the Israeli military, who become, for example, Israeli military police, who are usually Druze or Bedouin. But so the highest score you can get is 97, because you get 3 points deducted for being circumcised. So there's a way in which the body, you prove your Jewishness, you prove that you're the strongest you can be for your country, because you're also folded into this religious fabric around ritual. And then the weak are pretty much anybody that's not that ideal. So the female, the non-white, which can include non-white Jews, like Ethiopian Jews, Jews from Iraq. There's ways that the metaphors, the language that we use around health and the nation are deeply alienating to the people that are marginalized. And so some of the work that I do is to try and kind of find space, and a lot of people are doing work on this also, like the Intelligent Lives film is awesome. It's a really great kind of way to show how, even in our country, we've moved in kind of phases of like what to do with the sick person, the weak person, the child with Down syndrome, the fetus with Down syndrome. There's a whole like bioethical issue around whose body deserves to exist. And a lot of research now is suggesting that we don't need to see this strong and weak, valuable and not as valuable to the country in terms of the kinds of productivity that people wrap around value. Like what makes a woman valuable? Is it how many children she had that will become the future soldiers? Or is it that she can fight? I mean, can she work? There's lots of language wrapped up around politics that influences, that kind of bleeds into a lot of other fields, including medicine. And I think that kind of having an approach where people really see each other as all inherently valuable, I think that's where B'Tselem really has the most power, is that their group is called in the image of God, and everybody is in God's image. Like that's like a position that they take, which is really controversial in Israel right now, because a lot of the mainstream Jewish Israeli political rhetoric is that you're only valuable if you can fight for this country and also a certain kind of Jewish person. So it's like even secular Jews have like challenges there, but yeah. Great question.
Are there others?
I wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit about how you found yourself at this intersection of study, personally or faithfully, or how you, I mean, it is a crossroads kind of connective piece, and at whatever level you'd be willing to share your story.
Sure, yeah. So I'm from New York City. I was born and raised there, and my mom is from the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, and she was raised Catholic, and she's really dark-skinned. And my dad is from New York, but his parents were from Eastern Europe. They were child arrivals in kind of like before the Bolshevik Revolution, like before World War I. And I grew up in a mixed background, Jewish and Catholic, not quite white, not quite anything else. I learned English first because my mom didn't want me to have an accent. And so I do speak Spanish also, but I have the kind of grammatical errors that an Anglophone grown child of Spanish speakers would have, so it marks you a certain way. And my mom on purpose married a light-skinned man because she wanted my skin to be lighter, so that I wouldn't get followed around in stores in New York like she did in the 1960s. So there's a lot of like race and religious baggage that I was born into. And then I kind of ended up, so on my mom's side of the family, like a lot of immigrants, everybody said you had to either be a doctor or a lawyer to succeed in America. And my favorite cousin became a physician. He ended up he was in the Navy and then the State Department. And when I was little, to impress him, I would tell him and tell everybody that would listen, when I was like 6 years old, that I wanted to be a neonatal cardiologist. Because they are very hard words to say for a 6-year-old, and it sounded super hard and impressive, and like the height of success. Like, not only am I fixing hearts, but little baby hearts. I'm just gonna be amazing. And then I got to college, and I had a terrible chemistry teacher, and I was falling asleep, and I was really kind of, I guess, disillusioned or I felt like I was a failure for not going to med school, but I did do the legal studies minor, and then I ended up, and in high school, I went to Bronx Science in New York, and they have a really good program around the sciences, and I did a paper in my AP European history class on kind of the medical history in Europe, and I got really interested in history, and my dad is a historian. Well, he's retired now, but he was a history teacher in high school, public schools in New York. And I was always really drawn to reading, including historical fiction. And so when I saw that I was not going to cut it in the chemistry class in college, I switched. And the law class, Intro to Law, was at the exact same time as Intro to Chemistry had been the semester before. And I recognized so many people in that class. I was like, oh, you also dropped out of chemistry. But then I went to grad school for a PhD in history. And at that point, so my undergrad degree was in Near Eastern and Judaic studies with a minor in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies and in legal studies. And I just kind of got interested in this part of the world. I mean, it was like the late 1990s. The Middle East had been in the news like since, news existed. But I was curious, especially about Israel. And I ended up doing a high school program in Israel that was open to Jews of any background, including Jews like me that were technically raised Catholic. So it was a very kind of plural place. And I met Jews from lots of different backgrounds. I met Ethiopian Jews. I met Jews who were Orthodox, Jews who were super secular. And I got really interested in the other people that were in the country and how nobody was really addressing it. And then I did my junior year of college at Ben Gurion University, which is in Beersheba, which is in southern Israel. And I got to meet Bedouins. I started taking Arabic classes. And I met Syrian and Iraqi Jews who were Israeli. And so I got to learn a little bit about what it was like for them, for their parents in Syria and Iraq in the 1930s and the 40s, what happened to them that led to them deciding Israel was safer for them than Iraq and Syria. And I just kind of felt like this was a place in the world that I really wanted to understand. And then also selfishly, I was like, I want to save the world. But that's, it got me to learning about, and then the health stuff, having survived, being in the war in 2006 in Lebanon as a civilian with no military background, and having spent a year with Israelis who are pretty much forced into it. Literally, if you decide you want to protest the draft and your body is physically able, you get sent to prison in Israel. So unless you're female, and then you could be like, I want to have a bunch of babies. And they're like, sure, then you can do that. But yeah, that's pretty much, I guess, how I got to it. And I like working with students of all different backgrounds because I think a lot of students, not just in this part of the country, people grow up with specific narratives around these places. I had students who didn't know that Jerusalem was the third holiest city in Islam. And they're like, oh, well, now this makes sense that it's, and I'm like, yes, see, now you understand why. But yeah, so I like helping students kind of get to the place of finding empathy with lots of different groups. I think it can be a useful way to kind of develop, I guess, as a person.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I feel like trauma and healing are really timely lenses for looking at our own political situations, violence in our city, the pandemic. There's trauma to go around for everyone, and I appreciate just thinking about how different communities and how different people can be involved with healing, and may we all be part of that healing. Thank you again.